Okay. It seemed to work out before, so we'll try it again. Okay, I want to go over another problem verse here. And this is response to watching Luke's video, on Google Chat or whatever it is, his group. There's a verse in question here in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26 through 29. And it basically starts off at verse 26. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. Okay. Let me take this verse apart and let me just look at one little part of this verse that maybe people don't look at it the right way. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth. Now, the knowledge of the truth. If I tell you the gospel, but you don't believe it, and I've given you the gospel, I've given you the truth, but you don't have faith to believe it. You understand what this verse is trying to say is if you go on sinning, even after I told you Christ died for you, if you don't believe that Christ's sacrifice covered you for your sins, there no longer remains a sacrifice that you can stand under because you go on sinning, but you didn't accept grace. The book of the Hebrews was all about the Jews not accepting Christ. And this also goes back to the Jews who wanted to go back to Egypt in the desert. You see, they went through the desert in hopes of reaching the promised land. But you see, they didn't have enough faith to carry them through to the other side. This is why Moses struck the rock twice. If you think about it, it's sacrificing over and over again the blood sacrifice, and it doesn't make any difference because you still want to go under the law of Moses and not under grace. So Moses struck the rock twice. Why? Because that's a sign that he didn't trust in the rock to begin with. And this is what most Christians who say they fall away from, they never had the faith. So they wouldn't go through the desert to get to the other side. You remember, and you have to read your scriptures to understand this, that when the spies were sent out, Caleb, which means dog, by the way, which is very faithful. I believe it's Caleb is dog in the Hebrew. Caleb and Joshua, both went into the promised land, spying out the land, and saw a land of milk and honey for the taking, because they had faith that God was going to carry them through. But the other 10 spies for each tribe came back and said, there are giants in the land. They couldn't believe that their God would go before them to conquer and take the land. They wanted to go back. This is why they fell in the desert, because they didn't have faith. In what? In the promised land to come, through Joshua who carried them there. The blood over the doorposts. You know, this is why the book of Hebrews is hard for people to understand, because they equate it they equate these verses with God not that if we sin then there's no sacrifice. If we sin without Christ, if we sin without the faith, if after I've given you the truth you don't accept it or you can't believe it, then you don't have the faith. And so this is what it's talking about. For if we go on sinning willfully after you've been given the gospel, the knowledge of the truth, that doesn't mean you accepted it or believed it. That means that I gave you the truth, right? If you go on sinning and you don't have Jesus covering you, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment. And anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies. Anyone who sets aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Right? How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as an unclean thing the blood of the covenant by which he was sacrificed, and has insulted the Spirit of grace? What does this mean? Well, If you thought it was bad to be under Moses and be judged, imagine being given I give you the gospel, I gave you the truth, and you trampled underfoot the truth. You didn't accept the cross. You didn't believe or trust in the blood. You believed in walking in Moses. Because this is what the whole book of Hebrews was all about. Jews that wanted to go back to the law, strike the rock twice, not trust in the promised land and go back to Egypt and to slavery. This is what, if you read the book of Hebrews in its context, this is what this verse is all about. It's not about sinning after you have accepted Christ. If you accept Christ and sin, right? We all sin, but Christ's blood covers us. Imagine, here I have Christ, right? And I sin like all people, like Paul did, like we're human. And to say, oh, I've insulted grace. Now there no longer remains a sacrifice. What did I do? I created a worse sin. Why? I didn't trust in the blood that covers me for my sins. I trusted in the law of Moses. You see how that verse can't work any other way. But that if I sin willfully and I don't know the blood of Christ and I go back to the law, the sacrifice is gone. So to interpret it that I sin willfully after being saved means I'm not saved. Because how could I sin, right? If I sin, right, and I'm saved, then God will cover that sin. But if I sin willfully and not trust in the blood and think that I've got to strike the rock twice, or I think that I'm not saved, well, then I've committed the sin of disbelief. I haven't believed in the sacrifice. And there's what the sin is there. Take care. God bless.